just the technical stuff, not the rest.
Okay, ready, Emma?
Yep. But I do need a countdown. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of Widdecombe, Webb and Woberts. Except this time, there is no Woberts. My name is Emma Webb and I'm joined by former Shadow Home Secretary and Brexit Party MEP Anne Widdecombe and the actor and politician Laurence Fox.
Laurence. Abi Roberts.
You can send us your questions or comments via the live stream or by email at contact@newcultureforum.org.uk, or you can contact us via Twitter using the hashtag NCFWWW. So in the last 2 weeks, there have been panics about petrol, Extinction Rebellion storming the Paris Fashion Week's runway. Labour and Conservative Party conferences have been a big deal in the news, as well as a slew of idiocy about the women's rights debate and reports on universities forcing mandatory bias tests on their students. But first, let's start with the biggest story of last week, which is Sarah Everard and the conviction of Wayne Couzens. I've been hearing a lot in the last week about how this is to do with banter culture and explicit sexism becoming covert misogyny within the police and systemic misogyny. And I wanted to know what your view on that would be and what your take is on the whole Sarah Everard scandal.
I think we need to calm down, quite honestly. I mean, the hysteria that's poured forth from actually normally sane commentators on this. So we're now obliged to believe that every lone policeman is some sort of suspect as a homicidal rapist. And it's just complete nonsense. This was a one-off. I mean, are you afraid of doctors because of what Dr. Shipman did? Are you afraid of school caretakers because of what Ian Huntley did? It doesn't make any sense to try and derive from this very nasty but one-off event a general lesson. I mean, yes, it's quite true. I'm sure there is some banter amongst policemen, but as there is probably amongst the troops, for example, and amongst lots of groups, that probably wouldn't really stand the test of day. But how seriously do they mean it? How seriously do they mean it? And I think we've got to distinguish and just calm down a bit. I mean, what happened was horrible. But when people call and say women have got to be safe on the streets, so long as there is wickedness in the world, nobody is safe on the streets. Men, women and children. Nobody is safe on the streets.
Do you think, Laurence, that this is the next moral panic?
No, I agree with that, and I think it's been over dramatised. There's bad eggs everywhere. There will be in every profession. I do think it was interesting that they're saying that she got into the car because he used COVID regulations to do it. So I think it shows how badly organised the government's difference between guidance and law was, and so I think that it's an example of a failure of that. I think it's a tragedy. I grew up on Wimbledon Common when there was that horrendous murder all those years ago.
Rachel Nickel,
and it was people. These horrible things happen, and yes, I mean, other than the fact that he got her into the car via COVID regulations, I think it's unavoidable.
Why do you think it is that when obviously the story tipped into analysis and people started talking about why this had happened, what the solution is, as if there is one solution to it, that they turned to these questions of systemic something or other, as is usually the case, rather than, for example, I didn't see any news focusing on the fact that, explicitly focusing on the fact that this would not have been possible, or it wouldn't have been possible in the same way if he hadn't have been able to use those COVID regulations to arrest her for something that shouldn't have been illegal in the first place.
In a way, that's that's beside the point. I'm not going to blame COVID regulations for a very, very nasty man doing a very, very nasty thing. I blame his moral state, or rather the lack of moral state. That's what I blame. And I think everybody can get their own causes out of this. You know, the women's movement is saying, well, it's all misogyny, and, you know, the people who aren't quite so keen on some of the COVID regulations saying, well, it's all about that. It isn't. It's about one bad man doing a horrendously bad thing. But pick up your newspapers, there are children dying. You know, teenagers dying as a result of gang violence. You know,
but again, it's the abrogation of individual responsibility, isn't it? Still, in every on the right and the left, there's this tendency to try and find something outside of the individual's responsibility for their own actions, rather than just say they're bad people, they're always going to be bad people. But what do you think of, say, the Home Secretary's comments about reforming the police, people calling for Cressida Dick to resign? Is there something that does actually have to happen within the police force in response to this?
I think they do need to look at the banter culture. I mean, not, I think, because it leads to the sort of thing which Cousins did. I don't believe that at all. But because I think it does diminish confidence when it comes out. It diminishes confidence. But the idea, as people are saying, oh, well, you can't trust the police, I mean, is absolute nonsense, but it's also dangerous nonsense. You know, when a policeman now tries quite lawfully to arrest a woman at night, you know, citizens will take the law into their own hands, like they did following the George Floyd case, when the police were perfectly lawfully arresting a black man and they were set on by irate citizens who thought they were being racist. Also, what about a policeman just helping a woman late at night? You know, getting out of his car and going to help a woman who's drunk and vulnerable and swaying along a bit. Is he going to stop and think, I shouldn't do that because I might be suspected of goodness knows what? I think we need to think a bit. We need to think.
Yeah, I think it's absolutely right. He's just a very, very evil man. And as long as we live in this sort of ideologically driven world where there's zero everything, we're going to have zero death, zero everything, and now we want zero crime. And it's unfortunately human beings have fallen, and they have a propensity for evil, and the vast majority of people fight that. But you know, you can see it's beneath the surface of everybody.
I think that's a very Christian way of looking at it.
Well,
most
yeah.
Secular, well, people who have a secular worldview probably would.
How's the secular worldview working out for people at the moment?
Yes, quite. I mean, that's a very good question.
Oh, did you see? Possibly not. It's on the stranger parts of Instagram suggestions that Timothy Charlotte, because obviously this whole conversation has now started about misogyny and what they're calling new masculinity as opposed to toxic masculinity. And because obviously the masculinity has now been pathologized by psychologists in the United States. And I saw on Instagram suggestions that Timothy Chalamet, I don't know if you know who he is, he's a very sort of atypically masculine or atypically male actor, and they're saying that he is
atypical male actor?
He is now not particularly masculine. He is now the symbol of they're saying the new masculinity, which is, you know, these men who feel empowered to wear dresses and to be weak and to emote and that kind of thing.
You can still emote as a man. You can still emote as a man. There's no problem with emoting.
Emoting while male.
Well, I don't like men overdoing it when they're emoting, quite honestly.
No, I agree. One doesn't want to.
I mean, we've got Daniel Craig weeping because it's the end of the James Bond. I mean, first of all, it was his decision. Secondly, how many handkerchiefs did he get through on the way to the bank? You know, and it's just such a nonsense. And we've got all this nonsense. I mean, to emote in the face of a genuine tragedy, yes, that's one thing. But we emote over everything these days, men and women. Just call a halt to it.
Absolutely. Who's gonna? You don't want to.
Emotionally.
I wouldn't want Timothy Chalamet in a bunker next to me. In a foxhole next to me in a war.
Yeah, what is that phrase about you want your friend to be the man who would stand next to you in the shield wall? So we've got a question here from Rob from York. He says, a big deal was made that 79 women were killed since Sarah Everard, yet this ignores the fact that over double the number of men were killed in the same time.
Yeah. Why does an evil act have to be gendered? Or you know, why? It's utterly useless, pointless thing to do. It detracts from what the issue is, which is evil. And actually, thank God they caught him. It was a really excellent exercise in catching him, and he's never ever going to see the light of day again.
Yeah.
That's the bit that I'm happy about.
Sanjeev from Southall has said, sent some statistics. ONS says that men are 3 times more likely to be murdered than women. In 2020, the female homicide rate was 6 per million of the population, whereas for males it was 17 per million of the population. Where is the outcry about that?
Well, there isn't one, but on the other hand, I don't think this should be a gender war. I mean, this is about good versus evil, and it's about how we control crime. And the idea that there is some perfect world in which every woman will be safe on the street is a nonsense. But it's also a nonsense that, particularly in some inner city areas, that anybody can feel safe on the street at any hour of the day. I mean, the thing about the Sarah Everard case was it wasn't particularly late at night. She was on a main road. She wasn't walking through some dark park. It was perfectly adequately lit. She wasn't dressed provocatively. She was, just doing a perfectly normal thing that a woman does, which is to walk home after seeing a friend. And it happened. And it can happen to anybody. And children are murdered, and men are murdered, and women are murdered. And it's not a gender war. It mustn't become a gender war.
You can't eliminate bad people without eliminating the whole of humanity.
Yes.
Quite.
So, moving on to a sort of related subject, earlier this week, and I know that you've got a view on this, and I imagine you probably will as well, Laurence, the Justice Secretary, Dominic Raab, made that silly statement where he said, to quote, insults and misogyny is absolutely wrong, whether it's a man against a woman or a woman against a man.
He's usually quite sharp, Raab, isn't he?
Is he?
He was quite sharp. Well, I mean, he can be quite glib.
Let he who has never muddled up his speech cast the first stone, quite honestly. He wasn't defining misogyny. He was simply saying, doesn't matter which way hatred flows, it's bad. And the fact that he muddled the sentence so that it seemed as if he was talking about misogyny.
Was he making a point about misandry, saying misandry is bad? Was he intentionally obscuring it because he was afraid to say that misandry is bad? Or was he making the sort of statement that Keir Starmer and Boris Johnson beat around the bush with, suggesting that not everybody who has a cervix is a female?
Emma, you sound like one of those feminist nutters. I mean, I don't think it was anything to do with misandry and misogyny. I think he muddled his sentence. He muddled it. I've muddled sentences. You probably have.
But what does he mean
have because you're an actor.
No, definitely not.
What's he intending though? If he's muddled that up, what was he trying to say?
I had to look up misandry because I said, what's the opposite of misogyny? Because you hear about misogyny all the time, it's kind of endless going on about misogyny. And I had to look up. I said, and I found out that misandry was I didn't know it until about 4 or 5 years ago. But I thought, if you're going to keep walking around and gendering everything, like that, I think that we should have our own word too, which we do.
But do you think that's what he meant? That's the point that he was making?
No, I think he just muddled a sentence. What he was saying was hatred is wrong, whether it's men towards women or women towards men. That's all he was trying to say, and he muddled it. And that does happen. Politicians do muddle sentences. Surprise,
but
surprise.
Do you think it's definitely him muddling it up? Given that
I'm always very nervous at politicians
Boris
talking about
was
these
also he equivocated big time when he was asked the same question as Starmer, when he also equivocated. It seems that none of our politicians are willing to say that only women have a cervix.
Well, only women do have a cervix. It's a biological fact of life.
Yes, but you're hard pushed to find a politician that would agree with you in the current cabinet or opposition.
Well, then they shouldn't be politicians. I mean, if they can't live with the facts of life, they shouldn't be politicians.
But they're equivocating, presumably, not necessarily because they disagree with the view that is held by the majority of the public, but because they're just afraid to say anything
otherwise. Then they shouldn't be politicians.
Because they're really sort of...
It's appalling
if they're afraid.
Obliterate the... it's just obliterating women. In this world, that's what it's doing. It's saying no, your man can have a cervix if he feels like he has one. Its feelings don't care about your facts. Is 2021.
Actually, I think the most serious word you've used there is fear. Politicians should not be afraid to speak the truth. If they're afraid to speak the truth, they're in the wrong job.
Well, it's a prerequisite of the job nowadays for modern politicians, isn't it? They will sit on the fence. But for Boris Johnson, he said in his speech, which irritated me so much, he said at one point, he said, children at school are getting medals for everything. And then one sentence later, he will go on about, the abolishment of women with his cervixes line and stuff like that.
But it's the drift that Orwell spoke about in his essay on politics in the English language, where politicians use, or political language is used to obfuscate things. So rather than using language in a way that is specific to speak honestly about something, and I mean, you could find dozens of examples over the conference season of politicians doing, perfect illustrations of that, where they're actually using language to say as little as possible so that they can't be held to account for what their statements are. And I think that has got to be the result of the fact that they're just frightened of one of they might trip over a tripwire, an identity politics tripwire.
They haven't stood up for our language and the way we communicate, so no wonder they're frightened. Mm-hmm. They haven't. Our language is the way we communicate.
There was
brutalised.
Earlier this week, there was also a whistleblower, Sinead. I'm not sure I'm saying this correctly. Sinead Hayler, who's a doctor at King's College Hospital. I don't know if you saw this story. She has blown the whistle on an NHS policy document that apparently it compared patients who wanted to stay on single-sex wards, going back to your comment about raising women, people who wanted to stay on single-sex wards, she said, were being compared to racists and offenders who, quote, need trans education to improve their attitudes. And she also expressed concerns that the NHS had prioritised male transgender patients over women, that they were being heavily influenced by Stonewall, and that staff feared talking out about this even in cases of safeguarding, in case they would be charged with criminal offences. What do you think of that?
Well, I mean, there's a great muddle there. First of all, you can't be charged with a criminal offence unless you actually commit a criminal offence.
But then you have the police saying things like it's offensive. It's an offence to
they withdrew
to
that.
be offensive.
They withdrew.
They
withdrew that.
We still have non-crime hate incidents, don't we?
Oh yes, we've still got that. Absolutely, but it doesn't follow that you're going to get a criminal record. So I mean, I just think once again, I know I keep using this phrase. I think we need to calm down. We really need to calm down. But I can remember in the 90s. The battle was to get single-sex wards because there were too many mixed-sex wards and people found it uncomfortable. Not only the women, some of the men found it uncomfortable as well. And the whole emphasis was we're going to have single-sex wards. Now here we are, a couple of decades later, and suddenly, that credo has become a heresy. And we can't have single-sex wards, and we must have men, and they are men. On women's wards, and it's just a complete nonsense. And it's time, I think, that people did speak out and don't be governed by fear. Fear of a criminal record. You can't have a criminal record if you say things in a reasonable way.
Do you think it'll pass just as quickly as the same-sex wards passed? That this is something that's going to stick around?
It's getting
worse.
It's getting much worse, and it's the deliberate undermining of everything. The undermining of the word, the meaning of things.
It seems to be so deeply ingrained within the medical community. I don't know if you remember a few weeks ago, the Lancet, they edited something to. I can't remember exactly what it was.
Or people with cervixes, something like that. That's The medical profession are also telling you to read anti-racism books and and unconscious bias training. It's all heavily sort of statist rubbish. I hate it. And it's all nihilistic as well. So
and it all costs money.
It all costs money.
The NHS says it's hard strapped. I don't believe it because if it can spend money on that
am
sort
I
of stuff.
okay to say that I don't want to pay for people's gender reassignment surgery with my tax money? I don't.
You can say it.
Yeah.
Free speech in this country.
I just think I'd rather the health service treated people with cancer.
But is it something that you need to calm down about? To like as you were saying, if it is the case that a nurse might be afraid of getting an NCHI recorded against their name, and that will show up on a DBS check and may prevent them from getting a job in the future, is that egging the fear on to say that it's legitimate for them to be concerned, even if it's not strictly a criminal offence? It is something, and they can imagine circumstances in, say, Scotland, for example, where under the hate crime legislation that there could be an issue if someone wanted to raise some safeguarding concerns that might be regarded as transphobic.
There will be. There absolutely will be, won't they? But this stuff came out of, the non-crime hate incident stuff came out of the Royal College of Policing, which aren't elected anyway. So it's just total institutional capture by people that are unaccountable to the electorate, and it needs to stop. It's totally wrong.
The Royal College of Policing really does have an awful lot to answer for, because an awful lot of the political correctness of policemen saying they're going to check your thinking. How dare anybody say they're going to check your thinking? It has all come from guidance from Hendon. It's from the Royal College. But do we have a Home Secretary? Do we have a government? Do we have people who are supposed to deal with these things? I suppose we do. What are they doing? What are they doing?
They're saying build back better. That's what they're saying.
We've got a comment here from Jean from Bolsover says, criticism of Raab's comments, nothing more than cheap political point scoring. We all know what he meant, simply poorly phrased. So she agrees with you, Anne. And Pat from Dorkin says, the government is right not to make misogyny a hate crime. What about misandry? If there is a hate crime for the other, well, if there is a hate crime for one, then there should be one for the other too. Yet it's ignored. So do you think fight fire with fire? If you have one hate crime category, you need the opposite as well in order to cancel it out?
But we don't, do we? I mean, when you're actually looking at racism, you look purely at a prejudice against minorities. You don't look at prejudice against the majority. And similarly, wherever you look, wherever you've got these isms, it's always a one-way flow. And so at the moment we have a one-way flow. You can say what you like about men and get away with it, but if you say anything collective about a woman, about women, then you're guilty of a hate crime. So the idea that you can ever actually have a two-way flow, if you had a two-way flow, you'd actually have equality. You'd actually have equality, and we ain't got it.
Well, we've got an Equality Act which does the exact opposite as what it says on the tin.
Do you think the Equality Act pits people against each other?
Well, what's the point in calling it an Equality Act and then having lots of protected characteristics?
That don't cover everyone.
Yeah, exactly. So, put philosophical
and need to be
belief.
constantly expanded in order to continue justifying its own existence.
Well, it's used, isn't it? It was used by the Batley Group to say, this is protected in law, and it's like, no, it's not protected in law. Thank you very much. But it does. It's such a terrible piece of legislation that it allows people to use it really, really badly, and that's all you ever notice with these
It's presented as if all of the different categories that they list. I was looking at one of these on the tube. They've got all of these posters on the tube about hate crime, TFL posters with all of these different coloured hands on. And it lists categories, including gender identity under hate crime, even though in the Equality Act, gender identity is a common mistake that is made, something that I believe that certain lobby groups, I'm not going to name them just in case I'm not citing that correctly, but certain lobby groups misinform people that gender identity is part of the Equality Act. And I saw it listed on this TFL poster included in there. But this is the point, isn't it, that some people have made, which is that there are identity categories don't necessarily, not conflict with each other. So, the gender identity argument is currently in conflict with the sex-based rights argument, and the Islamophobia argument can be in conflict with the homophobia or transphobia argument, as we saw with the Birmingham schools LGBT row.
Yes.
So all of these tripwires are crossed with each other, and I wonder whether that is one of the reasons why often the people who end up getting in trouble are the people who are closest to it rather than the people who are furthest away. So it's often sort of liberals, people who, like Sally Rooney, who end up being attacked for getting something wrong.
It's there to divide. It's all it is there to divide people against each other, and if you do that, it means that you can commit deeper evils.
I mean, that wasn't the original intention of the Equality Act. That's where we now are. Where we now are.
Why do you think that's how this has ended up?
Oh, I think once equality is achieved, and you see, I would say, and I know, the earth and the sky will fall on my head as a result of saying this. So you see, that's a muddled sentence. It's the sky that's going to fall on my head, not the earth. The earth may swallow me up.
You can't ever achieve equality.
I think women have pretty well achieved equality. We can be prime minister. We can run companies. We've got the things that we were agitating for. And so what do? We turn around and say, oh dear, we've got all of that. can't lose the cause, got to agitate for something else.
Ever smaller causes.
And then it becomes ever more trivial. And that is what is going on.
What is it that Douglas Murray talks about? He talks about St. George having slayed the dragon, goes out looking for smaller targets.
Yeah, well, the thing that they'll go on to, as these sort of nasty, divisive groups that seek to undermine society go around jumping from one to another, from women to gay people to whichever one, the next will be mental health. That's going to be the new one, the invisible one. So, you know, that's where it'll be. It'll like, you're upsetting my mental health. Therefore,
I'm actually quite irritated at the way that mental health, which I think is very serious business, is utterly trivialised by being confused with stress.
Yeah.
Now, stress is something that we all encounter. You know, you can't be on this earth. I mean, it's an occupational hazard of being on this earth without being stressed at some stage or another. It doesn't mean your mental health is in danger. And I think we actually belittle real mental health problems.
And in some ways, not getting better is something that is lionised. It's almost like the sort
victimhood
of affirmation
is lionised,
thing.
isn't it?
Yeah.
That's where the once you can intersect all of your
Like
own grievances.
it doesn't help people in the sense that it doesn't help to pull them out of difficulties that they might be facing, because it's the sort of extreme subjectivity of
Well, you don't
all
have
of
to
it.
do anything if it's someone else's fault, do you? You can blaming someone is so much easier than doing something, and you know that's.
But again, it goes back to the individual responsibility point that people can feel trapped if they feel that, and I know this is a point that has been made about, you know, the whole debate around racism, that people feel trapped if they're told that everything is outside of their control, that everything is to do with someone else or the circumstances. It makes them feel that they are. It's the opposite of being empowered. It's the opposite of being empowered. You're told you're stuck there because it's not your fault.
Yeah, but it's all.
And so
always
everybody else
the
has
exact
to change.
opposite of. It's always achieves the exact opposite of what its stated aim is. Anti-racism is just racism, you know. And also the worst part of it is that there are people who are transgender in this world, and who are genuinely are. And you know, to jump on what is already actually a vulnerable group and to steal their cause off them. So that
some of them feel pretty strongly about it, actually.
They do.
Yeah.
And
I mean, their voices are drowned out, but they do.
Little narcissists going, well, you know, it's not enough to be called him or her. I've now got to choose my own little pronoun and you will call it me. Thank you
But that is
very much.
absolutely ludicrous.
That
is ludicrous.
There's one transgender activist who has actually made the point that all of these people like Ollie London and others who are, you know, increasingly strange identity categories, like Ollie London identifying as being South Korean, that this particular transgender activist I'm thinking of said that, you know, they don't want, or she doesn't want to be lumped in with all of these other people as if they are trans in the same way that she believes that she is trans.
No, they are. Those people are narcissists who are using vulnerable people. It's exactly the same as the racists. You know, these sort of Ibrahim Kendi people. He does more damage to black people than anybody else. He's more by telling them that black people can't achieve. And you know, Biden as well. He's you know, everyone always goes, "Oh, Trump's a racist. Trump's a racist." The stuff that comes out of Joe Biden's mouth is shocking. You know, black people can't use photocopiers and things like that. You're just like, stop it.
Yeah, but he's halfway dotty anyway.
He's halfway dotty, but it's a bit much.
If he does manage to get a sentence out, it tends to be
He's a funny
untoward.
Yeah.
We've got a comment here from BCAT who says, disassembling women's bodies in speech seems to me to have the intent of disassembling women's bodies in practice.
Huh?
I'm not sure.
Disassembling women's bodies in speech has the same intent as yeah. Well, there's a level of fantasy to it, isn't there? There must be.
And there's another comment here from Nikki O'Brien, who says, "We are living in a 1984 dystopian nightmare."
Yes.
Yeah.
And it is only going to get worse.
Yes.
Do you think it is going to get worse?
Yes,
Much
inevitably,
worse.
Because there is no determined...
What does worse look like?
Well, hang on. The reason I think it's going to get worse, if I can just do that, Emma, is that there's no determined leadership against it. None. I mean, we've just said, you know, where's the government? Where are ministers? There's absolutely none. And unless there is really determined leadership, you can't reverse or slow something down. And so it gets worse. And I think this will get a lot worse. Now, if you'd asked me to predict 10 years ago that government ministers were going to say that you, as Theresa May did, that you can just opt for which sex you want to be, I would have laughed. I would have said, oh, come on, that's ridiculous. Now it's happening. Now it's happening. So if you ask me what does worse look like, I dread to think, because it will be something I can't conceive of.
What do you
I
think
dream.
worse looks like?
Well, it's going to get horrendously worse because people will stop speaking to each other, and then people use other ways of communicating. That's what happens.
Yeah.
You know, and once the rage is stoked and stoked and stoked and stoked, as it is after the 70-year cycle that we've, well, no more than that now, cycle since the last time people took arms up against each other, that's what's going to happen. We'll end up in a pretty horrendous piece of violence, I imagine.
Bleak.
Sadly.
I'm not.
But
gonna
people
make
standing
any
up against it,
predictions
University
'cause
of Sussex stood up. You know, people just have to. All you have to do is hold the line. You don't even have to really do
Yeah.
anything.
There
You just
are
have to
some-
be yourself and not allow people to bully you with stuff which is lies.
Well, not be fear, it's fear.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's
exactly.
fear again.
Nothing to fear, but
Fear is what's driving this.
Yeah, it's a classic "live not by lies" mantra. Just try to be individually. Everyone try to be honest.
and
Say
fight
what
them
you
back.
think, and don't allow yourself to be bullied into not saying what you think is true.
I mean, like you yourself just now, you said, am I allowed to say this? And I said, well, you can say it.
Yeah.
You know, it doesn't follow that people will agree, but you can
Yeah.
say it.
It should,
and we
it
should
should be the case
able
that you're
to
only
say
allowed
it.
to say things that are deemed right.
Yeah.
Deemed right by
No.
who?
We
We've
should
not
be able to say what we think.
We've not reached the end of understanding. It's a life and humanity and meaning is an ongoing conversation. We don't get to the end of it.
So speaking of free speech, Exeter anti-abortion, an Exeter anti-abortion society that was labelled as being anti-choice by some students who wrote an open letter trying to get them banned from the university, have apparently received death threats for their pro-life activism. And this is a group that says that they promote the dignity of human life and striving for its protections, and that they equip their members with the tools to share the pro-life message in a sensitive and respectful way. And actually, the guild, the university, did stand up for free speech, actually, and again, another glimmer of hope. They said, no, we actually are in favour of supporting our students to interact with each other with rigour, and actually stood up for the rights of this group to exist. But what I found most concerning was that in this open letter, they were doing this classic double speak that you often see, where they say, we believe in people's right to an opinion, but not this opinion.
Yeah.
This opinion is beyond the pale.
Exactly.
And then they appeal to mental health as a justification for why someone expressing their views on a particular subject would physically or emotionally, psychologically harm another person.
I mean, it's a bit of a farce to talk about being anti-choice. What choice does the unborn child have? You know, I mean, if you're standing up for that child's life, you're standing up for the right of that child to live. Now, it can't assert that right. Somebody's got to do it on its behalf. So I've always disapproved of this expression, anti-choice. As far as I'm concerned, the best expression is love both. You know, both the woman and the child.
Yeah.
Because it's a child.
It's a straw manning of the other side's argument. I think that on that particular side of the debate, there's no recognition of the fact that there's an actual philosophical difference. They don't agree with they don't share the premises. So, for example, you'll often hear people saying abortion is healthcare, but they refuse to recognise that their opponent doesn't agree with them that abortion is healthcare, and that is the point of contention that needs to be discussed.
And what's
or
worse,
whether or not you refer to an unborn child as being a fetus, or it's part of the philosophical disagreement that they are actually refusing to engage with, because they say to do so would be harmful. That
It's
not
an American import as well. Sorry, Anne. It's an American import. We have the abortion discussion in the UK has been pretty quiet, really, and they're going, right, what's the next thing we can really divide people and stir them up over? You know, because people will have very, very principled views one way or the other on abortion, and it's just another tactic to divide.
But what's worse is that by trying to silence one side of the argument, you're actually doing women a disservice. There are plenty of women who will testify, and they do at pro-life meetings, that they were never quite certain that they wanted an abortion, but they were being pressured that way, and suddenly they were offered a different way by the life movement. And I get particularly angry when people say, oh, well, you've got to have some sort of cordon sanitaire around abortion clinics, in case pro-lifers go there and pray for anybody. But the fact is, we have people who have been heading towards an abortion clinic really not certain, really very uncertain, and they're suddenly offered an alternative, and they stop and they go for that alternative, and then you've got, a much happier woman, and you've got a live child. Now, that has got to be a big plus, and for people to deny that possibility is not promoting choice, it's actually denying choice.
And there's a straw manning as well of the other side when they're basically assuming always, this is the case with many different arguments, not just on the abortion debate, but assuming that the other side is bad and that they don't have women's interests at heart, that they don't recognise that their argument for pro-choice, they say this argument comes from a place of love for women and care for women, and that the other side also believe that their view is the loving and caring argument, but they refuse to recognise that the other side is not only a legitimate interlocutor, but also, not to dehumanise their opponents, not to just assume that they're bad, rotten people because they don't share the same opinions. And if you can't accept the other side as, not also intending to be a decent human being, then there's no grounds for a conversation, is there? It's not possible.
Well, they know they'll do it because you've got, who is it that started Planned Parenthood in America? Elizabeth Sanger, is it? I can't remember her name. Anyway, she's now being removed from, she's being decolonised from the Planned Parenthood movement because she was a eugenicist. And she was very keen on there being less black babies in the world, So they do know that there's evil in their own camp as well. So the whole idea that all it is a very contentious issue that people have strong feelings about, and if you can get involved in an argument, you can divide people while you do other evils.
While we're on the subject of abortion, what did you think of the court ruling against the campaign to equalise the abortion law with, now it's the case that people with Down syndrome, babies with Down syndrome, can be aborted until birth.
Right up to birth.
And the argument of
but
the
not
campaigners,
1 hour later.
Exactly, and the argument of the campaigners was this is inequality within the womb.
Which
you're saying that my life is not equal to your life just because I have Down syndrome.
It's evil.
And the High Court decided to not to rule in favour of the activists.
I mean, I found that an unbelievable judgment. I mean, there is clear discrimination there. I mean, what is the difference between a baby 2 hours before birth and a baby 2 hours afterwards? Nothing except visibility.
I was actually shocked to find out that was the law. I didn't realise that.
You didn't know that was
No, I didn't realise that it was possible
in the UK
to...
now.
Since 1990.
I didn't realise it was possible to abort a baby with Down syndrome up until the point
Since
of birth.
1990.
There are people on both sides of the argument, people who are pro-life or pro-choice, even though I don't really like those terms, but there are people on both sides of the argument who think that is despicable.
But if that child can survive outside of the womb, I mean,
Exactly.
I'm not getting into any of the arguments about over that, all that, but if that child can survive outside the womb and if it was delivered early or could survive, then it's murder.
It just strikes me as a law that was made by someone who's never met someone with Down syndrome.
Down syndrome people are fantastic.
I was in Parliament at the time of that law, which I was fighting very, very heavily, because it's not just a question of Down syndrome. There's a lot of other minor disabilities like cleft palate and club foot and goodness. Oh yeah, we've had to go through all of that in our time. So I mean, it's that exception was brought in 1990. Right up until that time, the Infant Life Preservation Act, which said that it's an offence to destroy a child capable of being born alive, was predicated on 28 weeks. And we went from 28 weeks to birth itself in 1990 in the course of that debate. And it's always been there. I mean, it's been there since that time. Now people are slowly waking up to it. But let me ask the question again, what is the difference between a child 2 hours before birth and 2 hours after birth? What is the difference between a child born prematurely and all the resources of medical science going in to save it, and a child of the same age in the womb who has no protection at all?
Well, in Virginia, in America, the child can be left to die once it's come out.
Well, we had a case in this country in 1987 in Carlisle where a woman went in for an abortion. The child survived the abortion and was left on a kidney dish gasping for breath for 3 hours. And the coroner recommended an inquest, which you and I would have thought, yeah, that should happen. Our Home Office turned down the request.
Is it fair again?
No,
Not
then. Not
but
then.
what is the what is the reason why these sorts of conversations can't take place in a reasonable manner? I mean, I remember watching a lot of the old, like the big questions when they would have a subject on abortion, without a made-up mind as a sixth former. And the only thing I took away from it was that people couldn't stop screaming at each other. It seems to be one of those debates where people, sort of early debates, where people just simply weren't able to have a civil, rational discussion about it without trying to demonise their opponents.
I can see the other side of the argument. I can, the Ella Whelan side of the argument that, if you really truly respected women, then you'd respect that this is my body. You truly respect
there's two bodies, there's a chance.
I know. But I'm saying I can see it, and I just very strongly disagree with it. But I wouldn't scream and shout at anybody. I just think it's an absolutely tragic thing to do.
So, though we've moved slightly on from the topic of free speech, I wanted to raise two stories with you, and we've got questions coming in about them, so I'm going to. St Andrews University and the University of Kent introduced these mandatory bias training courses. So St Andrews had this mandatory module which included having to agree with a statement, so it's agreeing with an opinion, that acknowledging your personal guilt is as a useful starting point in overcoming unconscious bias. And if they fail to pass this module, they weren't allowed to matriculate. And
don't go to
and so
University of
therefore
Kent.
can't
Don't go to Kent.
that
go
was
to St Andrews.
That was
Don't
St
go to
Andrews. The University of Kent separately had a mandatory course where they said there were a number of statements about white privilege, and you had to, I think there were 13 of them or something, and these included I can wear or dress in second-hand clothes without having people attribute these choices to the bad morals, the poverty, or the illiteracy of my race. Now, I think if I'd have turned up at Cambridge as an undergraduate from a working-class background, from a normal sort of state school, in second-hand crappy tracksuit, I probably would have been judged on the basis of bad morals, the poverty of my background, or the illiteracy of my... Well, not race, but...
By what right do people, or do the universities, by what right do they actually make that compulsory? It's a gross invasion of liberty.
So Rod Liddell was on GB News last night talking about this subject, and I asked him, did he think that that this is a kind of secular puritanism, that the universities have become religious again in the sense that they actually feel that they don't even realise, they don't recognise that this is not a neutral thing to do, that asking students to agree with opinions is not something that that you should make a requirement of entry into a university. Do you think that this has got religious characteristics to it? Like, how do we explain
the
new
what has
Inquisition?
happened here?
The new Inquisition, that's what it is.
The whole of this new sort of burgeoning woke is a religion. It has doctrines, it has rituals, it has confessions, it has everything. It's awful because it is exactly the thing that it's pertaining not to be. It's deeply discriminatory and actually, frankly, very racist. Mm-hmm. To sit there and to make an assumption about a skin colour group and saying that all white people are in some way privileged, and they don't, and they're also thick, that they don't see their own prejudice towards black people.
Do you think it's also historically ignorant of?
Yes.
Well, it's convenient. It's just conveniently divisive. It's conveniently divisive, and it's ideologically driven. And why do these universities get government grants?
It's funny because
they should be removed.
When they talk about lived experience, actually, for someone from a working class background, that's just an untruth. It's just simply not true. That's not going to chime with your lived experience if you grew up in Stockton on a council estate, is it? So on what grounds can they even? I mean, I guess we know on what grounds, but can they reason that requiring somebody to agree with something that it may not chime with using their own language with their lived experience?
It's the antithesis of education.
Mm-hmm.
To require somebody to agree with a statement is the antithesis of education. I mean, what you need in education is rigour and analysis and being able to weigh arguments like this.
Was
But
it
it does have to be
Alan?
based on, education does have to be based, you can't say that you start at nothing. Education starts with a certain set of things. Facts, for example, there's a woman and there's a man. Difficult to do biology without these simple facts. And we base our education system, certainly philosophically in this country, on values that have stretched back many, many hundreds of years. And we need to, of course, interrogate those things, but you've got to start from somewhere. And what this is just trying to wipe that all away. So that, that all of the decolonising of the curriculum and all of that is to wipe away the wisdom that families pass through the generations to each other, and it's quite frankly appalling.
Alan Bloom wrote that famous book, The Closing of the American Mind, and it's almost as if they're just trying to close get there early on and close their minds before they even start.
Well, they do with my own two kids. The stuff that they come out with when they get home is appalling.
We've got a question here from Alan from Nottingham, who says Exeter University should remember it has religious roots. One of its 3 founding institutions being St Luke's Diocesan Training College. I don't know if I've said that correctly. At Exeter Cathedral. I'm sure Anne can correct me. And also Peter from Woolwich says the government should stop all taxpayer funding to universities that embrace anti-free speech culture or make students take anti-bias training. What do you think of the proposed higher education?
I think you should strip universities of their university status if they don't promote rigour in education and freedom of speech. And if they don't promote that, they should be stripped of their university status because they're not actually an educational institution.
No, they're a madrasa. They're a secular madrasa. That's what they are. It is. That's what universities have become. It's like, you go in and you come out extremely devout. And the worst thing is that we haven't even got the whole lot of them out yet. There's a whole decade or and a half of these loons coming our way to run our institutions and be our doctors and nurses.
I'm going to do a famously clunky segue.
Okay.
while we're on the subject of devout people going into places and coming out more devout, party conferences. We have to finish on that because we can't not mention party conferences. Obviously, Labour didn't have a good one. The Conservative Party's mixed reviews of Boris's speech. So I was wondering what your views are on the 2 party conferences, who you think has come out on top, is the opposition essentially dead? Where are we at with all of this?
Never write off the opposition. It had a hopeless conference, and there's no doubt at all the Conservatives came out on top in terms of the conferences. But never write off an opposition, and I say that with feeling for this reason, that we all expected in the Conservative Party that we were going to lose the 1992 election, and we won it against all the odds, and we came back for what was then an unprecedented 4th term. And everybody in the House of Commons was saying Labour can't recover from this. If they can't win in those circumstances, they're never going to form a government, there'll be a boundaries review, blah, 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 blah. And yet, just a few years later, Tony Blair didn't just get in, got in with a record landslide. So never write off an opposition as dead. I don't think the opposition is dead. I think it's highly ineffectual at the moment. And I think Boris should make the most of that opportunity.
The winds can change suddenly.
The winds can change very suddenly.
I think that, if Keir Starmer took 93 minutes, didn't need to make his point, which is never a good sign.
What was his point again?
I didn't. Well, but again, I don't know what I don't know what Boris Johnson's point was either, to be honest. I think it shows the Tories' disdain for Labour is so visible in the fact that they think their main threat is the Greens. I think that's what they think. I think that they're more worried about the Greens.
Think that
And Labour have infiltrated with these woke university graduates who turn up and talk to 1.5% of the electorate about other countries. Labour, you would have thought there's huge amounts of votes out there for Labour to actually sit there and deal with.
Some of them were trying to run for the government of Palestine.
Yeah, but just deal with those social inequality. Should we deal with some of that, Labour? Should we get on with that, or are we going to tweet about Palestine?
Because Keir Starmer, it looked like he was sort of like setting himself up with some sellotape, trying to sort of paper the thing back together again.
I wasn't sure what it was about. That's that.
But Boris's speech was. I listened to it.
Speech was
I listened to it a couple of times, and actually the first time round I found it annoying, but well written. And he's a brilliant orator and all of these sorts of things. And the second time around, I found it spooky because it was so philosophically and morally inconsistent. And the way he pitched it and toned it, bearing in mind what we've just been through in the last couple of years in this country, and the assault on civil liberties, the appalling withdrawal from Afghanistan. I know that's not our problem, and all of this, Boris just sort of blundered through like everything's fine. I think if I was a Conservative, which I'm not, I would have been offended by what he said.
Just as an aside there, you say Afghanistan is not our problem, the interpreters are our problem.
Yeah.
We should jolly well, stand by them and make sure that we get that concession.
We didn't get the we didn't pull the trigger.
Oh no, we didn't.
Biden did it for virtue signaling reasons.
I've said it before. He started.
He's absolutely dotty. He did it so he could celebrate September the 11th and go, look, we've got out, but unfortunately we left all the people to be shot and murdered.
Do you think that having a sort of alliance between smaller parties could work to create a new opposition?
No.
Why not?
Right, I'll tell you why not. I lived through the 80s, and it was supposed to be a great sea change in British politics when the Liberals allied with the SDP, and they formed an alliance, and everybody said this was a sea change, and they didn't just have unknown people. They had, Foreign Secretary David Owen, they had a former Chancellor, Roy Jenkins, they had Shirley Williams, they had big people. And everybody said, this is it. And it fizzled in almost no time. At first it was strong, and then it fizzled. And effectively, when people are voting in a general election, as opposed to a by-election, when they're voting in a general election, they know they're electing a government. And therefore, they tend to ask themselves this question, who do I most fear? It's not even who do I most want. Yeah. And of course, everybody feared Corbyn. And everybody feared Kinnock before that. And therefore, you vote for the ones that are most likely to win. So I don't think, I'm sorry, Laurence, but I just don't think there is a future for an alliance of small parties.
I think it's very difficult, but what there is I don't think you have to achieve parliamentary success to be an effective politician necessarily. Do you know what I mean? And I do think it would be nice, at least, to remind the politicians that women do have services, and that's and that's absolutely fine thing to say. That if you did get a group of smaller parties together who would threaten them in however small a way, that you might make them be a bit more conservative. I think that's probably your best hope.
Shepherding parties.
A shepherding party, but then you've got some people. The thing about politics is it's exactly the same as showbiz, except in showbiz everyone wants to be famous, and in politics everyone wants to be powerful. But what you want in politics is people who don't want to be powerful. You want people who want to serve, and we've just that's what we've lost.
But that would be describing almost or maybe it wouldn't. So I'll put it to you: is that a change in the way that democracy is done in the UK? And do you think that the whole idea of the Great Realignment? Do you think that's just a myth? Do you think that's the system is more robust than that? Things are not going to change as dramatically as we might think they are. Or are we actually heading towards a form of government where you have a sort of one-party state and then these smaller shepherding parties? Yeah,
well, certainly. But the Conservatives have got away with quite a lot of things that if Boris was in opposition over COVID, I actually feel he's been fairly bought off now with this Endless Build Back Better levelling up stuff that he goes on about, which no one knows at all what it means, other than we're all going to have a much more miserable time in the future. But if Boris had been in opposition and hadn't been bought off by Klaus Schwab and that lot, he would have opposed all of this corona stuff. He would have provided an opposition to it. Even if he went along with it first, but he would have opposed it. But now he's all singing, all dancing, con-socialist Boris Johnson.
On that note, we're going to have to wrap up, but I want to alert viewers to the fact that you are making a return to acting.
I am.
In the form of Hunter Biden, no less.
I know.
Oh, you're not.
I am. I imagine there will be a very temporary sabbatical for my acting cancellation. And
so if people want to watch this space, how do they do so?
Oh, I don't know. I didn't. I would just watch the film.
It's on the near horizon.
I'd start filming it in.
How near is the horizon?
25th of October, first day shooting.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much, Anne. Thank you, Laurence. Thank you for watching, and we will see you next time. Like if you feel like it, and subscribe, and we will see you again soon. Thank you, Laurence.
Sorry,